Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about one of the things that I have found over the years as someone who has been able to bring my bench up is, someone who a lot of people said, you suck at the bench, your bench is bad. Now I'm up here into my mid to late 40s, and I'm finally hitting good numbers. And one of the things, and this obviously isn't everything, a lot of it includes things like shoulder health, checking my ego, all of that stuff. Again, fatigue management, these things are all important. Don't get me wrong. They have all been enormous factors. But one of the really big things that I've noticed, and this is advice I've even gotten from other guys who bench crazy good numbers over the age of 40, uh, who are all raw, meaning they don't use any equipment. Pause work, doing the vast majority of what you do for your pressing and chest pressing is pause. Now, the exception could be dumbbell work, but that's also supplemental work. And what I have found is that consistently, if I pause more, I do lots of pause work, and sometimes longer pauses, sometimes shorter pauses, but generally speaking, coming to a complete stop on your chest, stopping touch and go work. Now, of course, this obviously depends on things like the ability to touch correctly, meaning you know where you can touch, your wrists are stacked. Again, when I make these statements, this assumes that you have proficiency on the bench press, because you will get people who say, well, I can't even touch my chest, but that's an entirely different issue. That is almost exclusively, barring a pre-existing pathology, that is almost exclusively not knowing how to set up correctly, how to stack your wrist correctly, where to touch the bar, people who are too loose. Those are the things that create those problems. If you're tight, you know where to touch, which again is usually the lower chest. If you know these things, you are not going to have these problems. Again, barring some sort of existing shoulder issue. And, that's too much for me to cover here of all the different possibilities. Again, that is way beyond the scope of this video. But when you set those things aside and you know how to set up correctly, really pause work is the biggest key. And I consistently find with my own clients that the lifters who won't do pause work, you can't get them to do it, they can't check their ego. When you do force them to pause, they start to find that they can't really lift any real weight. They're shocked. A lot of these guys will do a lot of touch and go stuff and, think that they have a good bench, and then you can't get them to pause. And when you make them test an actual paused max, which is your real bench, it's sometimes 20, 30 pounds weaker than they thought it would be. Okay, and I do mean I have seen this happen, and it's quite a shock. It's quite a shock to them. But what I find is that when we do lots of pause work, we build a bigger chest. Okay, that's a big part of it. We could come over and talk about shoulder health and all that also, which I'll cover too in here. But bigger chest, a better strength off the chest, right? When you do a lot of pause work, what happens? You are putting tension and making the chest work harder at the lengthened position of the pectorals. And I really like the pause work to where you get set up to where you put the chest into the most lengthened position, and that's what you see for most of my benching. You'll notice it's usually pinkies on the rings. For me, that puts my pecs at a position to where they're the most lengthened. And I'm not saying that is always going to build the best max, but as far as your actual chest building and building speed out of the bottom, from a training perspective, training that way will do that, because you're stuck in that lengthened position. Well, then when you pause, you're forcing that position, that lengthened position, to hold briefly and then engage. So the pectorals are forced to work harder on a rep to rep basis. Well, what does that translate to? Well, that translates to really good joint angle specificity for getting speed out of the bottom, no matter what you do for grip later. All right, so we have that. We also get the most potential pectoral development. Again, we come over to what we know on the bench press, that muscle size matters enormously for the bench press. Guys who are the most stacked in their upper body usually have big benches, irrespective of technique, irrespective of speed strength, all this other stuff. They have big benches sometimes when they don't even know how to bench. They can brute strength their way through it. So by doing all this pause work, particularly, in grip twist to where you are forcing the pectorals into a lengthened position, you really, really build thicker pecs. Okay? It's a big deal. Then we come over to the actual technique end. What does the pause work force you to do? It forces you to learn to stay tight. Okay? It also forces you to learn to generate a lot more neural drive out of the bottom. Well, when we go to test a bench press later, what happens when we actually have to test our bench? It's going to have to be paused. But now we've practiced that. Now we have good neural drive repeatedly over and over and over. Okay? Also, when we pause a lot more, we tend to learn our best touch points better. So if we come over to the technique end, so we covered the hypertrophy end, but let's really talk about that technique end. If you're forced to pause all your rep work and you're pausing all the time, you start figuring out very, very quickly which touch points, where you touch on the chest or where you get the most speed or where you feel weakest or strongest off the bottom, because you have to do it all the time. There's no way to cheat. There's no bouncing. So what does that do? That teaches you to figure out where your perfect leverages are on the touch point. And so like even when you go to hit a heavy 5-rep set, we know every time that on that first rep, if you don't touch it in the right spot, it feels heavier than the second or third or even sometimes fourth rep, right? It teaches you to find your correct position. So even before we get into, again, the neural drive, the speed strength, any of that, all this touch work to where we're pausing on the chest teaches you to stay tighter, teaches you to find your best leverages because you're forced to all the time to get the weight started, right? If you miss touch, it gets real hard. Okay? Teaches you all of that. It builds bigger pecs. Then what's the other thing? It's less wear and tear. Why? Because you can't do as many reps. You can't do as much work with the same amount of weight. So from a training stimulus, we get superior stimulus on a rep-to-rep basis, which also means that we're building less overall fatigue. Okay? So if that's the case, we get less beat up. Because let's be honest, when we're cranking out heavy touch and go reps, come on, you know it beats you up. Everyone out there who does a lot of it, what do you guys all eventually start talking about? Your shoulders hurt. Things hurt, right? It's less stable, it's bouncy, you have to do more total reps with the same heavy ass weight to get the same size and strength benefit. You see where I'm going with this? From a recovery perspective, it works, it makes sense. Now, am I telling you that this is the only way to do it and people have never become amazing benchers while doing a bunch of touch and go? No, they have. I'm simply creating the case for why I have found this works very well for myself and for my clients. Okay? And I have found it to be quite effective. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.